Continuing in The Great Wheel written and illustrated by Robert Lawson. This is chapter 7. Here's the opening picture. The next few weeks passed in a delirium of work. Some of the jobs in New York had been rather rushed and hectic, Con thought, but compared to this one, they seemed like restful vacations. The moment they stepped out of Mr. Ferris's office, Uncle Patrick was transformed into a roaring, driving mass of energy. No wonder Mr. Ferris called him his right hand. He was hand, arm, feet, voice, and brawny back. He seemed to be in a half-dozen places at once, down in the hole, out among the dump carts, in the office, at the supply shed. Con could keep track of him only by his bull voice and the flash of the red beard. Wherever he appeared and wherever his voice carried, the men became infected with his spirit. No need now for fires at which to warm themselves. Coats and mufflers were discarded, and despite the biting cold, the sweat began to flow. Before they even reached the excavation, Uncle Patrick was roaring orders. The derrick yanked out Danny's inadequate shoring. A squad of Swede carpenters appeared from nowhere, and new planks and timbers were soon being assembled. Before long, a veritable cofferdam, tight and massively cross-braced, was being driven down. Cofferdam. Another derrick arrived. The force of diggers was doubled. The dripping scoops of sand and muck came up faster and faster. The dump carts couldn't keep up with the flow, and more were sent for. Con was kept racing hither and yon up and down the mud-caked ladders to the supply shed, to the office. Now he was helping Danny boss the diggers. Now helping the Swede timber workers. Now holding a tape or plumb line for the engineers. When darkness put a stop to their labors, the excavation had reached a depth of 16 feet. The new shoring of the 20-foot square hole was well and solidly built. Huge bonfires were left burning to thaw out the surface for the next holes. As they stumbled wearily across the cluttered waste of the fairgrounds, they were joined by Martin Brennan and his crew. "You've picked the wrong job, Con, me lad," Scrimer laughed. "Us riggers are working in a nice warm shed." "And getting soft," Con jeered. "Wait till you find yourself on the top of a derrick, like a monkey on a stick, with a wind off the lake whistling the snow around your ears, and you'll wish you had some blood in your body instead of Thames water and porter. The next day, the pace, if anything, increased. A railroad spur was extended to the site. A huge concrete mixer arrived and was unloaded. Con and a gang knocked up a makeshift shelter of canvas and corrugated iron for it. More laborers arrived, and work was begun on the next 2 holes. Scrimer and the 2 Norwegians rigged 4 more derricks. Steam fitters came, bringing a boiler and a carload of piping. A maze of steam pipes was laid beside the track where the sand would be dumped. Heating pipes were hung in the shelter around the concrete mixer mains. Mains were laid to the excavation. By noon of the 5th day, Danny came to report that the first excavation had reached hard pan at 36 feet. "Mr. Ferris promised it at 35 feet, Uncle Patrick laughed. "Not a bad guess, but I'll tell him he must be getting senile." "All right, Danny, clean it up." Then he bellowed for the steam fitters. By sunset, steam pipes had been hung in the excavation, and 2 huge Negroes had fired up the boiler. Con and Uncle Patrick stood at the bottom of the hole, looking up at the golden sky through a network of steam pipes and cross braces. The cold pipes clanged and banged as the steam began to circulate. "Well, lad," Uncle Patrick said, "I promised to get you out of a sewer ditch, and here I got you down in a 36-foot hole in the ground where you couldn't see the evening star without you had the neck of 4 giraffes on you. Cheer up, though. A month from now, and you'll be 36 feet up in the steelwork and wishing to heaven you were back in your steam-heated excavation." "How do you suppose Mr. Ferris knew that we'd strike solid bottom at 35 or 36 feet? Con wondered. "How?" Uncle Patrick answered. "My boy, if I knew 1/4 of the things that are in that head of his, my brain would be splitting my skull into 2 halves. At that moment, Mr. Ferris's head appeared against the sky. "A nice, clean, solid job, Pat," he called down, "and 2 days ahead of schedule. About what I expect of you. Don't let that young nephew push you too hard, though. Remember, you're not as young as you once were." He smiled happily as Uncle Patrick's outraged bellow came up from below and turned to his companion. "You can start pouring tomorrow, Walker. he said. "And keep it going until they're all finished. Put on a night shift. Pat will keep one hole ahead of you if he has to dig them himself." Shortly after sunrise the next morning, the concrete mixer was rumbling and grinding steadily. 2 processions of wheelbarrows moved unceasingly up the wooden ramp carrying sand and stone. 4 gigantic Negroes, their faces already gray with dust, spelled each other, dumping sacks of cement into the mixer's insatiable maw. From a short inclined trough, a stream of wet concrete ran and dripped and plopped into the depths of the great square hole. To Con, looking at the small, inadequate stream, it seemed impossible that the hole would ever be filled. But already the bottom was covered, and the pudding-like gray tide was starting almost imperceptibly to creep up the hissing steam pipes. Uncle Patrick brought Danny over to look. "There now, Danny," he said. "Do you see how Mr. Ferris and me work concrete in freezing weather? 'Tis only child's play, this. When you're on a river bottom with 30 feet of water over your head and an air pressure on you would crack the drums in your ears, then you're doing a man's work. Now, get back to your digging and let's hear no more talk about how things can't be done." At sunset, a night shift of laborers came on. Kerosene flares were set around here and there to light the work. The procession of wheelbarrows continued without interruption. The mixer ground and rumbled. The stream of concrete plopped steadily into the hole. When they returned the next morning, the hole was a third filled, and 4 heavy twisted steel rods were being hung from the cross braces. The engineers, with transit and tape, checked their placing with the greatest care. "Anchor bolts," Uncle Patrick explained. "With them buried in the concrete and bolted to each leg of our towers, ought to stand up to any gale that ever blew, and an earthquake or 2 thrown in." The work went on systematically now. There came a warm rain that turned the site into a sea of mud. It was followed by a spell of 0 cold that turned the mud into iron-hard ruts and hummocks. But the steam pipes kept the sand dry and unfrozen, the concrete setting properly. As each foundation was finished, the mixer was shifted to the next hole, and the pouring continued almost without interruption. Days stretched into weeks unnoticed. Con had lost all track of time. At night he ate Mrs. Murphy's good food and staggered up to bed. There were no Sundays off, for there could be no stop in the concrete pouring. There was no time to talk with Martin Brennan or even Uncle Patrick except for short consultations on the work. He did realize that the days were growing a bit longer, but that meant only longer hours of labor, for their working day was from sunrise to sunset. It came as a sudden surprise when, one afternoon, Uncle Patrick heaved himself up out of the 8th excavation, wiped his hands on his muddy overalls, and announced, "Well, laddie, there goes the last scoopful of muck. Our sewer work is done. Now let's clean up this mess." Half the diggers were let go, and Con set the rest to straightening up. 2 days later, he and his gang suddenly ceased their labors, startled by a strange stillness. The concrete mixer had stopped. The fireman dumped his fire. The engineer tied down the whistle. The shrill blast threw the draftsmen, the riggers, and the rest crowding from the sheds. As the scream of the whistle died away in the last watery gurgle, Mr. Ferris himself came out to congratulate Uncle Patrick. "Well done, Pat," he said, "and a week ahead of schedule. You'd better take a couple days off, you and your nephew both. You deserve it." The next day, coming over to collect some pay, Uncle Patrick and Con surveyed the now deserted scene. The sand pile and its pipes, the small mountain of crushed stone were all gone. The concrete mixer had been loaded on a flat car and hauled away. Leftover planks and timbers were neatly stacked. Only the steam boiler and its lone Negro fireman remained. The pipes buried in the foundations would be kept hot for some days still. The result of the previous weeks of bustling labor did not look impressive. Only 8 evenly placed slabs of concrete that might have been chicken house floors, each with 4 heavy bolts protruding a foot or more. "It doesn't look like much for all that work," Con said. "It does not," Uncle Patrick agreed, lighting his pipe, "unless you know what's underground. Over 4,000 yards of concrete. 8 great monoliths. The way scientific men of future ages may be digging them up and wondering what strange race of people buried them there and why. They'll little guess that it was all for the amusement of the public at 50 cents a ride." Con enjoyed the short rest. He had seen nothing at all of Chicago, so Uncle Patrick showed him the city, which did not impress him very favorably. Compared to New York, it seemed quite crude and garish, and the ever-present aroma of the stockyards and slaughterhouses was far from pleasant. He bought a few clothes and a fur cap. He also purchased a buffalo robe to send to Uncle Michael. The shops were full of them at ridiculously low prices. With considerable struggle, he managed to write quite a long letter to his cousin Agnes. He would have liked to send one to Trudy, too, the thought of her blue eyes, serious and wide with trust, as she said, "You will come if you will come. It is your fortune," had lain warm in his memory ever since that last evening at sea. But he did not know her address, even her last name. He felt quite sure that the post office department, wonderful though it was, could hardly cope with a letter addressed simply to Miss Trudy, Wisconsin. On Monday, they reported back for work. Con still could not get used to the deserted air of the place. Wait, here he is writing his letter to his cousin. Con still could not get used to the deserted air of the place. He had a sinking feeling that the whole project had fallen through. The office shack was even more forlorn. Most of the engineers and draftsmen were gone. Mr. Ferris sat in solitary meditation before one of the glowing stoves, his hat on the back of his head, his feet propped on a box. "Welcome, Pat," he said. "All's quiet along the Midway. The lull before the storm, you might say. I've sent most of the boys over to Detroit to check on the steelwork as it's fabricated. You might go along and keep an eye on things for a while. I want every piece of steel that goes into this construction checked and rechecked for accuracy. Every piece clearly marked and numbered. I've given them a schedule for shipments and want it carried out to the hour. We can't be sorting out mixed up lots of steel here in 3 feet of snow or mud. We can't waste time reaming out inaccurately placed bolt holes or straightening bent rods or girders. We shall have 4 times more steel to erect than there is in the Niagara Falls Bridge. It took them 3 years to build that, and we will have exactly 5 months. It will take speed and accuracy." "I'll take the next train," said Uncle Patrick, "and I promise you this, Mr. Ferris. For every 16th of an inch of error you find in that steel, you can slice that much off the end of my nose." He grabbed up his hat and rushed out. Mr. Ferris, lost in thought, resumed his contemplation of the glowing stove. "Is there anything you'd want me to be doing, Mr. Ferris?" Con finally asked. "Nothing special," his employer replied. "Lulls like this are very infrequent in this profession. Enjoy it while you can. Sit down a while." He lit a cigar and leaned back in his chair. For some time he talked quietly of his work, of the bridges and tunnels and railroads he had built, of his research work with the steel companies. "It all becomes more or less routine after a while, Con," he said. "The problem's pretty much the same. This wheel thing is a delightful change for me. Fun, really. Something different. Yet it is not a ridiculous notion, a Ferris's folly, as many contend. Every detail of it is based on the soundest engineering principles. It is completely practical and will be just as safe as any steel bridge or building ever built. It cannot fail to operate successfully. Yet, just because it's something that has never been done before, it has met with nothing but opposition, timidity, and ridicule. I'd hate to be the man would speak disparagement of it in earshot of Uncle Patrick," Con said with a grin. Mr. Ferris laughed. "I would too," he said. "He's a grand man, your uncle. I don't know how I would get along without him. But tell me about yourself. How do you like working with us?" So Con told him about his life in Ireland, about Uncle Michael's letter, and about the work in New York. Mr. Ferris listened with such sympathetic attention that he even told, somewhat hesitantly, of Aunt Honora's prophecy. "Wouldn't you think it a strange thing, Mr. Ferris," he asked, "her to be telling me about riding the greatest wheel in the world, and now me being here to help build it and all?" Mr. Ferris threw his cigar into the stove and watched the momentary flare. "Very remarkable," he said finally. "Remarkable and wonderful. But it doesn't astonish me especially. It may surprise you, Con, but you see, we engineers, supposedly so hard-boiled and practical, are great dealers in dreams and visions. As much so as poets and artists. For everything we build is first only a dream. Then we make the dream come true. Instead of brush or pen, we do it with steel and concrete, with slide rule and tape and transit, bolts and rivets. But first was the dream." Out there, right now, there's just a messy field of frozen mud and some slabs of concrete. But there's also a vision. Close your eyes and think hard, and you can see it. The great towering wheel turning slowly, majestically, soundlessly, lifting people up for a little while into the clear upper air, out of the dust and noise of their everyday existence, giving them a glimpse of wider horizons than they've ever known, perhaps a closer sight of the evening star. I wonder if Ferris's folly is as foolish as it seems to some. Con had no answer, but he began to understand how Uncle Patrick was bewitched by the man.